Hello, fifth graders. Are you having a good day? I hope so. We have finished reading chapter 12 in Night of the Spadefoot Toads. We have discussed the theme and have been working on identifying how the characters respond to challenges to determine the theme. We've also compared and contrasted settings. These strategies help with reading because they keep our minds focused on how the text interacts with the storyline and how we can connect our own lives in different ways to various situations. Today, we will continue determining the theme of the story by identifying details and how the characters respond to challenges. We're also going to use context clues and personal knowledge to determine the meaning of words and phrases as they are used in the text. Do you know what type of poem this is? Let's read it. Dry as dust, Spadefoot Toads. They can deal solo with dryness but give them rain, and then toads explode, by Marilyn Singer. So what kind of poem do you think this is? It's called a haiku. A haiku is a poem that has 5 syllables in the first line. Syllables are like beats. They can deal so low. They can deal so low. Okay. The second line has 7 syllables with dryness, but give them rain. And then 5 again in the last. And then toads explode. This is, so have you read haikus before? They're a lot of fun. I love writing them too. Challenge, can you write a haiku about frogs or toads? Maybe spadefoot toads. What does the last line, toads explode, mean? Do you think the toads are actually exploding? This is figurative language. It is not the toads are not actually exploding. The figurative language we call a hyperbole. But a hyperbole is an exaggeration. Do you remember if there were any hyperboles that were in chapter 7? Let's review and maybe that will refresh your memory. So Ben was talking with Mrs. Tibbets about ways to save the spadefoot toads. But Mrs. Tibbets didn't agree. She said it wouldn't stop Tabitha from selling the land, and her relationship would be worse with Tabitha than it already was. Ben contacts the Massachusetts Endangered Species Program, hoping they can help save the spadefoot toads. Mrs. Tibbets finds out Ben emailed the Massachusetts Endangered Species Program, but believes it's too late to help save the vernal pool. Ben wants to save the spadefoot toads. Ben sends an email to the Massachusetts Endangered Species Program to ask for help. Mrs. Tibbets finds out what Ben did. However, she thinks it's too late to help. Let's read. Chapter 13. Mr. Nickleby would like to see you in his office, Mrs. Coocher says to Ben. He wants to see me? Ben asks. What for? I don't know, she says. The secretary just sent me a note asking for you to come to the principal's office. The last bell will ring in a few minutes, so you'd better get your things and hurry down there. Ben walks down the empty hallway, wondering why Mr. Nickleby sent for him. He's never been called to the office for doing anything wrong before. He doesn't like Mr. Nickleby, but not just because he's the principal. Ben can't put his finger on why, but he just doesn't trust him. Could I be in trouble because of my schoolwork? He wonders. He hasn't done his geography report, but Mr. Nickleby couldn't have heard about that. For all Mrs. Coocher knows, he's been working on the report all along. When he reaches the office, he sees his mom and dad just outside it, sitting in the chairs against the wall. What are they doing here? He gets a sick feeling in his stomach. Before Ben can say anything to his parents, Mr. Nickleby strides out of his office toward them, wearing one of those fake little smiles that adults give kids when they want something out of them. Hello, Ben, Mr. Nickleby says. Why did you all come in? Ben looks at his parents for some sign, but their faces don't reveal anything. Come on, champ, his father says, smiling. but even his dad's smile isn't very comforting. Something is really wrong. So, why does Ben feel sick to his stomach when he sees his parents in the office? Can you justify your answer with text evidence? Have you ever been called to the principal's office to find out your parents were waiting to see the principal also? I would think I was in big trouble. Does Ben know why he would be in trouble? What do you think the reason would be? Let's go on. Mr. Nickleby gestures for them to come into his office. As Ben goes by, his mother reaches out and touches his shoulder. Mr. Nickleby drags in a couple of extra chairs so there's a place for each of them to sit. Then he positions himself behind his desk like it's a fort or something. Ben's mom pulls her chair close to Ben's. What's wrong? Ben wonders. Did something happen to Agatha? Is one of my grandparents sick? Mr. Nickleby leans back a little and folds his hands. Ben, I asked your parents to come in so we could all talk about a couple of things. All of us here together. All right? Have you ever noticed that when you think something is wrong and the more time the adult takes without saying anything, the more nervous you get? I wonder if that's how Ben is feeling. Sure, Ben's voice isn't much more than a squeak. How are you getting along with the kids in your class? Are you getting used to being here? Sure, Ben says. Yeah. Anybody in particular you're having a hard time with? No, not really. He could do without Frank Murley and his buddies, and Ryan sometimes drives him crazy, but Ben's not about to say anything that would get anybody in trouble. Mr. Nickleby pauses for a moment, scratching the side of his neck. Ben looks at his parents. They're trying to hide it, but he can tell they're upset. Finally, his dad speaks. We've been talking with Mr. Nickleby while we were waiting for you. He'd like to ask you a few questions about Mrs. Tibbets. So I want you to look at this paragraph. How does it support the theme of adjusting to new places and making new friends? It looks like Ben does consider Ryan and Frankie friends, even though they get on his nerves. Well, maybe not close friends, but he is accepting them for who they are, right? Especially since he didn't want to get them in trouble. I wonder if they consider him friends. Let's go on. Okay, says Ben. This doesn't help much. He still can't figure out what's going on. How do you like Mrs. Tibbets? Mr. Nickleby asks. Fine. I like her fine. I hear you've helped her around her house a little. Uh-huh, Ben says. Yes, sir. What do you do when you go there? Now Ben is confused. He's sure there's a right answer and a wrong answer, but he can't think of what that might be or where this conversation is headed. It feels like a trap. I helped her in her backyard, and one night she showed me some toads in a little pool. I have a question for you guys. Have you ever felt that when you were asked a question, you needed to give a specific answer, but because that's what they expected, and that you weren't really supposed to answer what you thought or felt? Seems like Ben is feeling that now, doesn't it? Why do you think he feels like it's a trap? All three adults stare at Ben. Mr. Nickleby breaks the uncomfortable silence with another question. Anything else? No, Ben says, shaking his head. Mr. Nickleby draws in a breath. What about the snakes? Did you help her with snakes? No. Did Mrs. Tibbets tell Mr. Nickleby about how he let the snakes out? Is he in trouble for that? Does Mrs. Tibbets have some poisonous snakes? Rattlesnakes, for instance? Ben glances over at his parents. His dad's sitting there looking like he's trying his best to keep his mouth shut. His mom just looks worried. Couldn't you ask her? Ben doesn't want to say more until he figures out what's going on. I'll talk to Mrs. Tibbets, but first we'd like to hear your story. Ben, his dad's eyes looked tired. Just tell Mr. Nickleby what you know. Well, she did, but they got away. Did she let you help with the snakes? Mr. Nickleby asked. No, not really. What do you mean, not really? Did she let you get near them? No, she... Well, Ben, Mr. Nickleby interrupts, here's the problem. That's not what you told some other kids. I know, but that was just a story I made up. But we understand that Ryan Brisson said it was true. Suddenly, Ben's dad sits forward. Wait a minute, Mr. Nickleby. We've talked about this already. The snakes got away. Mrs. Tibbets called us and told us. Ben doesn't know anything about it. Ben glances over at his dad. His parents trust him, but they don't know what really happened. I want Ben's side of the story, Mr. Nickleby said. Ryan didn't know anything about it. He was just saying that so the other kids would believe me. He's never ever even been to our house. So, do you remember back in the story when Ben didn't tell the truth at the very beginning? He's had to cover for his lies every time the subject came up, and he has been very uncomfortable around people he was not truthful to, like Mrs. Tibbets. Now the question about the snakes is coming up again, and Ben feels really bad because even his dad is defending him, but he is defending Ben because his father doesn't know the truth and believed what Ben told him. Whoa, this is a mess. How do you think Ben is feeling right now? I would think he's feeling really bad. Mr. Nickleby leans forward. So you didn't have anything to do with the snakes? Ben looks at his parents. He bows his head. What is it, Ben? His mother asks. What happened, Ben? His father asks. Now they're both concerned. I let them out, Ben whispers. What did you say? Mr. Nickleby asks. I didn't hear you. I let them out, Ben says louder. I didn't mean to, but I did. Ben, his mother says, you told us you didn't. I know. I'm sorry. Did Mrs. Tibbets know you opened the cage? Mr. Nickleby asks. No, I didn't tell her. She told me not to touch the cage, but I did, and they got out. I'm going to pause here for a minute. So sometimes when we read scenes, characters, and the characters in stories, even fictional stories, we can learn from their experiences, choices, mistakes, and successes. So what are you thinking that you would learn from Ben's experience right now? Yeah, let's read on. Ben, why didn't you tell us? His mom asks. I couldn't. I wanted to, but I couldn't. And then finally I told Mrs. Tibbets the night of the Spadefoots. She wasn't. Mrs. Tibbets should have told you, Mr. Nickleby said to Ben's parents, and she shouldn't have left Ben alone with the snakes. Suddenly Ben understands. Mr. Nickleby isn't mad at him. He's mad at Mrs. Tibbets. She told me not to. Ben tries to keep his voice under control. I wasn't supposed to go near them. It wasn't her fault. She told me not to go near the snakes, and I did it anyway. All right, says Mr. Nickleby, shifting in his chair. I think I've got a pretty good picture of what happened. No, you don't, Ben protests. Okay, Ben's dad says. He puts his hand on the back of Ben's neck and gives it a gentle squeeze. It's all right, Ben, says Mr. Nickleby. We don't need to talk about this anymore right now. He relaxes back into his chair. What about your classes? Any problems there? Ben shakes his head. I hear the 5th graders are doing a big report on ecosystems. How's yours coming along? Think Ben's learned any lessons about not telling the truth? Wonder what's going to happen. Okay. Ben can't get his mind off the snakes. Why didn't he just leave the cage alone? And why did he have to tell stupid Frankie Murley about them? Everybody stands up. Mr. Nickleby extends his hand for Ben to shake. Ben doesn't want to, but he forces himself to put out his hand. The principal's palm is moist with sweat. Will Mrs. Tibbets be okay? Ben asks. We'll see how things work out, Mr. Nickleby says. It really wasn't her fault. I know that's what you think, Ben. Mr. Nickleby guides him toward the door. Why don't you step outside and let me talk with your parents for just a minute? Excuse me. Ben waits just outside the office listening. He can hear Mr. Nickleby's voice, but he can't make out the words. Just as school lets out, Ben grabs his backpack and dashes down the hallway, dodging between the kids pouring out of the classrooms. He runs all the way to Mrs. Tibbets' room. She's not there. So, why is Ben worried about Mrs. Tibbets? It appears Ben has gotten Mrs. Tibbets into a situation that is not good. What do you think will happen? Mr. Nickleby appears to be holding Mrs. Tibbets responsible for Ben letting the snakes out. Do you think it was Mrs. Tibbets' fault? Why or why not? Chapter 14. Ben slumps down in the back seat of the car. Agatha sits beside him, chattering a blue streak. For once, he's grateful for her mouth. Excuse me. He looks out the window. The leaves on the trees are opening and the lawns and fields are turning a soft yellow green. He opens the window a crack. The air is warmer than it was yesterday. He thinks about the vernal pool and wonders if it has shrunk even more. When they get home, his father stands by the front door as Ben's mom and sister walk in. Ben tries to slip by him, but his father catches his arm. Ben stops and looks up at his father. Ben, you've never lied to us before. His father isn't yelling. He'd rather have him yell. I didn't lie, Ben says. I just didn't tell you. Same difference, his father says. You should have told us. You hurt me and your mom. I know, Ben says. It was too hard. Well, look where we are now. It's much worse than if you had told us. Ben nods. It's true. And Mrs. Tibbets made a mistake too. Dad, don't blame her. Mr. Nickleby doesn't like her. I can see that. She may be a good person and a great teacher, but still, she is, Ben says. They both stand there in the doorway. Finally, his dad shakes his head and says, well, we'll all learn something from this. Why don't you go do your homework now? I have to get back to work. I'll see you at dinner. So what does Dad mean when he says, well, we'll all learn something from this? What do you think Ben's dad has learned? We have a change in setting. Back in his room, Ben sits at his desk and stares at the wall. Pretty soon his mind is back on Mrs. Tibbets' land and the Spadefoots. He's made everything worse now, somehow. The Overtoad would know what to do. For starters, he could swallow Mr. Nickleby and Mrs. Tibbets' sister-in-law and the men with the bulldozers. Ben rummages through his backpack looking for the sheet about the ecosystems report. Only 1 week left. If he starts on it now, there'll still be time. Amphibians of the World is sitting on his desk. Ben drops his backpack and leafs through the book, skipping over the Amazon rainforest in Central America until he comes to North America. He flips past the pictures of the tree frogs and leopard frogs and the enormous Rocky Mountain toad. When he comes to the picture of the Colorado River toad, he remembers the one that sat in their laundry room in Tucson. Boy, that was a long time ago, he thinks. Then he turns the page, and there it is, the eastern spadefoot. It's not fancy like the leopard frog, or big like the Rocky Mountain toad. Nobody will miss it when it's gone. So when we look at this page, what part of the text tells us Ben is getting accustomed to his new town, his school, and making friends? How do you know this? He's actually not looking at information about the Sonoran Desert anymore, is he? He keeps going back to the ecosystem in Massachusetts, and especially the toads. I would say that's evidence. Let's keep going. He thinks about Mrs. Tibbets. Could she lose her job all because of a couple of rattlesnakes? If she does, it will be his fault. He thinks about Ryan. His friend stuck with him at lunch, in spite of Ben's stupid comment about the crossed eyes. Ben smiles, thinking about Ryan's attempt to stand up for him. Poor goofy Ryan. Even when he's trying to help, things go wrong. The phone rings and he slams the book shut. Another ring. Mom and Agatha must be outside, he thinks. He picks up on the fourth ring. Hello, a man's voice at the other end of the line says. I'm calling for Ben Maroney. Whoa, wow, the plot is thickening. Who do you think is calling Ben? Sounds pretty serious since the man is using both Ben's first and last name. I have an assignment for you now. You will need to read the rest of the chapter 14 and all of chapter 15. I have a few questions for you to answer at the end of chapter 15. After you have finished reading, refer back to the text and answer the questions. Use complete sentences. Don't forget the capital letter and the end mark. You can do this, and I will see you next time.